Let's start at the top. The user interface layer, which we all know by now, is branded as Copilot. First, we'll begin with some very loose analogies. Satya likes to compare Copilots to Excel. What does he mean by that? Basically, the idea is when you start it up, you immediately get a UI that you as an end user can start using. Of course, underneath the UI, there's a ton of code supporting and driving that UI, just as there is in Excel. So if you follow Satya's analogy. Um, Excel and Word presents you with a canvas to start writing on right out of the box, but of course there's tons of code underneath. And for Word and Excel, those are DLLs and libraries and so on, but for Copilot there are LLMs and models and training data and so on. Microsoft has adapted the Copilots to each of their apps, so there are obviously different capabilities in different Office applications, and we'll take a look at those in just a second. The point of this is, ironically enough, this is more than new Clippy, which some of you may remember from Office 97, when it died shortly thereafter. Copilot really is much more than Clippy, and in some ways is the fulfillment of Clippy's original ambition. So now Copilots are appearing everywhere in Microsoft's application portfolio. And we've got a convenient list which we keep up to date on the directions on Microsoft's site. It's yours for free. There's the URL in the bottom right. But all of this begs the question, and we talked about this a few slides ago, are these conversational UIs becoming the default UI for all applications? Well, it's too early to say, and Microsoft may have to pry 3-layer deep menus from our cold, dead hands. But if you read the tea leaves, it makes you think. By the way, if you want to try something fun, ask Word to write an essay about yourself. Results can be surprising. And I'll also add that while Copilots do present a nice conversational UI, they may not be as intuitive as Microsoft thought. See, I get these emails every month from Microsoft with tips on how to use Copilot, which maybe belies the notion that they're incredibly intuitive. Anyway, Copilots have been in general availability for less than a year. It's clear now that the early value came from easy out-of-the-box features like summarizing Teams meetings and long articles and coding, which we will talk about in a second. The big value, I think, is coming from connecting to local enterprise data. Let's see how that works. So just to give you a brief idea of what this looks like, this is the Copilot for Microsoft Word. This is its current UI. It does change from time to time. We'll ask it to write a quick article about the benefits of Copilot. It'll think about it for a second, and then it'll start writing an article on our behalf, and it's pretty good. And here we are with actually something that's pretty useful, which is we're going to create a pivot table from these cells. And this is something that I don't know about you, but every time I have to create a pivot table, I have to go to the Microsoft help pages to re-understand how to do that. So it's thinking about it, it's analyzing, as it says, and it's created a pivot table for us. As it finishes up, we can, here we are, we can now add it to a new sheet, and there is our pivot table. Pretty cool. So as we said, the value of Copilot, real value, Microsoft would say, lies when it can connect to your local organizational data, like documents in your SharePoint libraries. So here, our user is asking to write a contract similar to the one they've already written. That means that Copilot can reach out to SharePoint, find the library where the old contract is stored, retrieve it, and write a new one similar to it, changing the names and maybe a few terms. So it augments the generation of new content by retrieving data, hence RAG. And we'll have a lot more to say about RAG apps as we continue our tour of Microsoft's strategy. An important point, however, is that your data, the contract in this case, is not used to train a public LLM. That is, it's not exposed to the rest of the world. It's kept private to your organization. That's not to say there aren't any issues. And we'll talk about those in just a second. Now, the same mechanism, of course, can be used to access data not just in Microsoft 365, but in other sources as well. For example, SAP. Same idea. Now, the very first Copilot was GitHub Copilot, and it leverages the vast amount of code in GitHub to help coders code. There's now a free version, but there are paid versions with many more features. We've written lots of reports about it, and Microsoft is heavily investing in it, probably because there's a lot of competition from both other vendors like AWS and the open source community. GitHub's probably the furthest along, however, and it can help you not just write code, but write according to your organizational standards, follow enterprise patterns, find problem areas in your code, and explain your code. It's kind of amazing, actually, and this quote from the bottom from a friend of mine may signal that we've hit a tipping point. GitHub was originally positioned as an assistant to the coder, but he feels now that he's assisting Copilot, which is kind of interesting. And here we are in GitHub. This is some code that I'm using in one of my projects. It's an open source code, and I'm just wondering how the heck it works. So I can open GitHub Copilot and ask it to please summarize this code. And there it goes. It tells us what it does. Now there are issues. Let's say HR has a SharePoint site and one HR professional uploads some salary data to a document on that site. Even if nobody else knows about that document, Copilot can find it right away. So Copilot can access that Microsoft graph. It can see all the SharePoint and Word documents and PowerPoints and so forth. And with the pre-configured, with those connectors we talked about a few minutes ago, it can access other applications like SAP. All of which means that we have to protect this data from Copilot. We have to make sure that we've implemented the right ACLs and permissions and encryption and sensitivity labels and e-discovery so that any given individual can only see content that he or she is authorized to see. And we'll talk about the tool that we use to do that called Microsoft Purview in a moment, but suffice it to say for now, most of those key features that we need in enterprises are only available with E5, the most expensive tier. Okay, wrapping up our quick tour of Copilot, we've seen that it is a brand and it's a technology and maybe even the new user interface for applications. Well, we'll see. The reason why may be that it's a zero barrier for entry. Just load the application and ask it to do something. In the early days of Copilot, there was a lot of FOMO, but we're now finding that that $30 per user per month cost may be negotiable with Microsoft, suggesting there's some price resistance. And the reason for that may be that the ROI is notoriously difficult to measure. It's hard to say if you're writing 20% or 30% more contracts today than you were the day before you got Copilot. Microsoft is investing in tools to help customers find the ROI, and we've written a bunch of reports about it, and the directions on Microsoft's site. And last thing I'll say is that Microsoft is revving the Copilot underpinnings, the models, from time to time. However, risks still exist. As we talked about, it can have very fast and even sudden unauthorized access to data, so it's important to protect your data. It can plagiarize, it can hallucinate, and we'll talk about the regulatory aspects a little bit later, but they are significant and well worth paying attention to.